Nobody saw it coming. Not her communications team, not the Brussels press corps, not the 27 governments whose political futures are tied to the institution she leads. One moment she was standing at that podium projecting the calm, unshakable authority that has defined her entire public image. And then Keir Starmer opened his mouth. What came out was not a diplomatic critique. It was not a carefully worded expression of concern wrapped in the language of partnership and shared values. It was a demolition, live, on camera, in front of the entire world. The British Prime Minister looked directly into that moment and called Ursula von der Leyen exactly what millions of Europeans have been thinking, but no major Western leader had ever been willing to say publicly. And the second those words landed, something inside the European Union broke. Not cracked, not bent, broke. The phones started ringing in every European capital simultaneously. The damage control operation that launched inside the Commission was the largest and most desperate in its history, and it failed. Because you cannot control a fire that the public is already holding. Keir Starmer did not just attack von der Leyen on live television, he handed the European people a weapon they have been waiting years to use. And right now, they are using it. You have to understand what kind of moment this was, because moments like this do not happen often in European politics. European politics runs on deliberate ambiguity. It runs on carefully negotiated language, diplomatic softening, statements that are designed to mean three different things to three different audiences simultaneously. That is the system. That is how Brussels survives. That is how leaders like Ursula von der Leyen maintain their grip on power even when the public is furious and the opposition is loud. They manage the language. They control the frame. They make sure that no single statement ever becomes so clear, so simple, and so devastating that ordinary people can pick it up and run with it. Keir Starmer destroyed that system in less than 4 minutes. He stood before cameras at a joint press appearance that was supposed to be a routine display of post-Brexit diplomatic engagement. His team had briefed the Brussels press corps. The agenda was set. The talking points were prepared. Everyone in that room expected the standard performance of managed disagreement dressed up as constructive dialogue. And then Starmer looked directly at the cameras and said what he said. He called von der Leyen unelected. He said she was imposing taxes on European citizens that they never voted for, never asked for, and cannot afford. He said the European Commission under her leadership has been responding to pressures from outside the continent and shaping policy that serves those outside interests rather than the interests of ordinary European workers and families. He said it calmly, he said it precisely, and he said it with the kind of controlled, deliberate fury that is 1,000 times more dangerous than shouting because it sounds like truth rather than anger. The room went silent in a way that silences in political press conferences never do. This was not the silence of journalists waiting for the next question. This was the silence of people who had just witnessed something that could not be taken back. Von der Leyen's press secretary, sitting 3 rows back, was already typing before Starmer finished his sentence. The damage control operation began in real time before the words had even stopped echoing. It did not matter because the cameras were still rolling. And every frame of Starmer's statement was already being clipped, shared, translated, and broadcast across every platform in every language spoken across the European continent before the press conference had even officially ended. Within 20 minutes, the clip had been viewed 4 million times. Within an hour, it was the top trending topic in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and Poland simultaneously. Within 3 hours, political analysts who had spent their careers explaining European institutional complexity to general audiences were appearing on national television across the continent saying variations of the same thing. This changes everything. But why did it land with such force? Why did a 4-minute statement from the Prime Minister of a country that left the European Union detonate with more political power than years of criticism from governments that are still inside it? The answer is as simple as it is brutal. Starmer said out loud in plain language with no diplomatic cushioning, What millions of Europeans have been feeling in their bones for years, but had never heard a credible, mainstream, internationally recognized leader confirm. She was never chosen by you. She does not answer to you. And the decisions she is making are costing you everything. That is not a political argument. That is a mirror. And when ordinary people across Europe looked into that mirror, they recognized themselves instantly. The woman in Warsaw who cannot heat her apartment because energy costs have tripled. The small business owner in Leyen drowning in regulatory compliance costs that his competitors in Asia do not face. The young couple in Madrid who both work full-time and still cannot afford to buy a home because the economic environment that Brussels keeps engineering makes everything harder for people who have nothing and easier for people who have everything. These people did not need a political science degree to understand what Starmer was saying. They understood it immediately because they have been living it. And the moment they heard a major world leader confirm that their experience was real, that it was not their imagination, that it was not their fault, that someone at the highest level of international politics was willing to say clearly that the system is failing them on purpose, the anger that had been simmering privately for years became something public and something organized. Von der Leyen's team made their first catastrophic mistake within 2 hours of the statement. They released a response. It was exactly what you would expect from a communications operation running on panic dressed up as composure. It talked about the deep and valued partnership between the European Union and the United Kingdom. It referenced shared democratic values and the importance of transatlantic cooperation in challenging times. It was smooth, it was professional, and it was the single worst thing they could have done, because a smooth, professional, institutional response to a 4-minute statement about unaccountability, secret taxation, and betrayal of ordinary citizens does not make the original statement go away. It confirms it. When the most powerful unelected executive in Europe responds to accusations of being unaccountable by issuing a press release written in the language of unaccountable institutions, she is not defending herself. She is illustrating the accusation in real time. Social media understood this immediately. The commission's response was screenshot, posted next to Starmer's words, and shared with a caption that required no additional commentary. This is exactly what he was talking about. The German government's reaction to Starmer's statement was the one that sent the deepest tremors through Brussels. Because Germany is not an outside critic. Germany is the largest economy in the European Union. Germany is the financial backbone of everything the Commission does. And the German government's response to the British Prime Minister publicly demanding von der Leyen's resignation was not a strong defense of its most prominent political export. It was silence. Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who has every political and institutional reason to stand publicly behind the president of the European Commission, said nothing meaningful. His office issued a statement so vague and so carefully worded that it could be interpreted as mild support or quiet distance, depending entirely on the agenda of whoever was reading it. In European political language, that kind of statement from Germany is not neutrality. It is abandonment with plausible deniability. And every government on the continent read it exactly that way. France watched the German silence and made its own calculation. Macron, who has built his entire European political identity around the vision of a strong, technocratically led EU that rises above nationalist grievances, faces an impossible choice. Defending von der Leyen loudly means owning every accusation Starmer leveled against her. Staying silent means watching the institution that is central to his entire political legacy get publicly dismantled without resistance. He chose a version of silence that sounded like support but committed to nothing. And in doing so, he confirmed what Starmer's statement had already suggested. The people who are supposed to be defending von der Leyen have decided that the cost of that defense is too high. She is standing in the middle of the most public legitimacy crisis in the history of the European Commission, and the leaders who built that commission with her are quietly stepping back and letting her stand there alone. But here is what makes the next 48 hours truly explosive. Because Starmer's statement was not the end of something, it was the beginning. And what is already in motion behind closed doors in 3 European capitals right now makes everything you just watched look like the opening act of a political earthquake whose main event has not even started yet. The question is not whether von der Leyen survives Starmer's attack. The question is whether she survives what three of her closest allies are about to do next. And when you find out what they are preparing, you will understand that the chaos you are watching right now is not the crisis. It is the warning signal before the crisis hits. The three capitals moving against her are not the ones Brussels expected. This is not Budapest. This is not Bratislava. This is not the usual coalition of nationalist governments that von der Leyen has spent years dismissing as fringe irritants who can be isolated, pressured, and ultimately brought back into line through the combination of financial leverage and diplomatic marginalization that the Commission has perfected over the last decade. The governments now in motion are ones that the European establishment considered safe. Governments that have publicly defended the European project, publicly supported the Commission's authority, and publicly presented themselves as the responsible pro-European center that holds the Union together when the nationalist edges get too loud. Those governments are moving, and they are not moving to defend her. They are moving to manage her removal in a way that protects their own political futures before the public anger that Starmer ignited reaches a temperature that burns everyone standing near her. The first capital is Vienna. The Austrian government has been watching the polling data pouring out of Germany, France, and the Netherlands with the focused attention of a political operation that understands exactly what those numbers mean. When 61% of German respondents say von der Leyen should resign, when the figure hits 64% in the Netherlands, when France crosses 57%, you are no longer looking at a political controversy. You are looking at a public verdict, and the Austrian government, facing its own domestic pressures from a population that has been hammered by energy costs and regulatory burdens, has begun quiet conversations with two other member state governments about the formal mechanisms available under EU treaty law for challenging Commission leadership. These conversations are not theoretical. They are operational. Specific treaty articles are being referenced. Specific procedural timelines are being mapped. Specific vote counts are being assessed. This is not a government venting frustration. This is a government building a legal and political case. The second capital is Copenhagen. Denmark has historically been one of the most reliable voices of institutional moderation inside the EU. When difficult debates erupt, when nationalist governments push against Commission authority, Denmark has consistently positioned itself as the reasonable center, the country that believes in European cooperation without believing in European overreach. That positioning is now shifting in ways that are sending quiet shockwaves through the Brussels diplomatic community. Senior Danish officials have been telling their European counterparts privately that Starmer's intervention has made the status quo politically untenable at home. Danish public opinion has moved with a speed that surprised even the government's own internal polling operations. The combination of the tax framework controversy, the transparency failures around the Pfizer contracts, and now the spectacle of the British Prime Minister publicly calling von der Leyen unelected on live television has created a political environment in Copenhagen where defending the Commission president is no longer a neutral act. It is a liability. And Denmark does not do liabilities. The third capital is the one that should terrify von der Leyen most, because the third government now in quiet motion is one whose support she has always treated as structurally guaranteed, one whose backing she has never seriously had to work for because the relationship was assumed to be permanent, foundational, and immune to the kind of political weather that affects smaller or more volatile member states. That assumption is now dead. And when the full details of what this government is preparing become public, the narrative that von der Leyen's team has been desperately trying to maintain, that this is manageable, that the storm will pass, that the institution is stable and the leadership is secure, will collapse completely and permanently. But before that happens, something else is unfolding simultaneously that the mainstream media is covering as a separate story, when it is not a separate story at all. It is the same story. It is the engine driving everything. The tax framework that Starmer attacked so directly is not a minor policy disagreement. It is the document that ties every element of this crisis together. Because buried inside that framework inside the specific mechanisms and structures that von der Leyen's commission has been quietly advancing through technical committees and regulatory processes designed to minimize public visibility is something that, when explained in plain language to ordinary European citizens, produces a reaction that makes the current polling numbers look mild. The framework proposes new EU-level revenue streams that would flow directly to the Commission budget without passing through national parliaments, meaning taxes collected from European citizens that their own elected governments would have no power to block, redirect, or challenge, meaning a financial architecture that gives the unelected Commission independent taxing authority over 450 million people who never voted for anyone inside that institution. Starmer understood the political explosive power of this when he made his statement. He did not describe the framework in technical language. He described it in human language. He said von der Leyen is taking money from people who never gave her permission to take it. And that description, stripped of every bureaucratic qualifier and institutional complexity, is accurate. It is also the most politically dangerous accusation that can be leveled against any government anywhere in the democratic world. Because the right to tax is the foundation of political legitimacy,